And people have answered C as in Charlie for the screen that's being currently shown. Where is Gualala? It is in northern Sonoma County. So go ahead and put in the chat box if you've been to Gualala Point Regional Park. Yes, no, wanna go. It's definitely one of my favorite parks. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with our presentation. Again, thank you for joining. All right. So as I mentioned, Gualala Point Regional Park Past and Present is part of our series Stories of the Land that looks at the various natural, cultural, and political forces that shape our parks and the surrounding landscape. And for this particular presentation, we are going to be focusing more on the intrinsic value of Gualala Point Regional Park, and I'll talk about that later in the presentation. So I'm going to start out with the introduction to Gualala Point Regional Park, the biodiversity and cultural diversity of the area. And when I talk about biodiversity, I like to think about humans as part of that biodiversity also, and the demand of natural resources to this particular area. It's very rich in natural resources, and I'll also talk about that. The intrinsic value of parks. My co-host, John, he will be talking about logging and fishing history.
Hi.
John, yeah, thanks for saying hi, John. John is also our volunteer coordinator for Sonoma County Regional Parks, and he will be talking about logging and the fishing history in the area, the changing landscape of Gualala Point Regional Park, and then he will also get into more of how this park came to be, and it does have to do a lot with sea ranch and oceanic properties, and then I will close us off. So just let's get started. So Gualala Point Regional Park. I'm going to quickly check the chat box to see if anybody, or John, has anybody put in the chat box if they've been to Gualala Point Regional Park?
Yes, a couple people have already been, and then also, but some have not visited. So,
okay, great. I do encourage you to visit Gualala Point Regional Park. It is 2.9 miles of trails along coastal bluffs. This is the kind of view that you will get. It's absolutely stunning. And as I mentioned, it's our northernmost park, and it's located up here on the border, which is this Gualala River, which John will be discussing more, is really a great geographic boundary between Sonoma County and Mendocino County. And so this right here is where Gualala Point Regional Park is located. Gualala Point has about 103 acres, and that doesn't include the campground, which is across Highway 1. So we are also in charge of that, and John will talk more about the campground. But as you can see, it's where the Gualala River meets the ocean. I love this about this park. It's very unique, and this ecosystem in itself, estuaries are extremely unique. The 2.9 miles, we do have ADA accessible trails that go all the way out to the beach, and we do also have beach wheelchairs for folks who need them. It's also a great place to go whale watching. It's right along the Pacific Ocean, which is part of the migration route for various whale species. Humpback whales, blue whales, orcas have been seen along there. Gualala Point Regional Park is also an access point to Salal Coastal Access, which is another trail within the park. It's absolutely stunning. Lots of redwoods and ferns, as you can see from this image, and it also has some really nice small little waterfalls. There's also a visitor center located here, which is really cool. John will talk more about the style and the changes around this landscape here in this area. But they're inside the visitor center. We have skulls and different things that represent the biodiversity, the flora and the fauna that live within the park's parameters and in the ocean. And it's run by volunteers, but at this, we had some teenagers come out for a camping trip, and they got to meet our park ranger assistant, Roberta, and you can see this teenager's holding, this is a skull of a sea lion. So we have different specimens to kind of give you an idea of who lives there. And we also have an area that just focuses on talking about the different indigenous communities of the area, and a video that they made. So let's talk about the name Gualala. So I pronounce it Gualala, but it's pronounced Gualala. And again, if you could go to that chat box, which is at the end of your toolbar, and if you could put in there A, B, or C. Gualala means an uncommon fish, Pomo name for where waters flow down, or is it C, the last name of a Russian explorer? So if you could go ahead and put that in there. And and I see some folks are answering. Great. Looks like you all know your history up here. Yeah, it means where water flows down in the Pomo language, and it's actually, there's a little kind of local joke that they know you're a tourist if you pronounce it Gualala, and so if you pronounce it properly, you're a local, Gualala. So since we're on the topic of where the meaning came from in Pomo culture, I just want to recognize that the Gualala Point Regional Park is in Pomo and Kashaya territory, the local territory. There's various indigenous communities throughout California that are still thriving. And I'd like to take a moment on behalf of Sonoma County Regional Parks and myself to honor the past, present, and future generations of indigenous communities in this area. In 2015, the Kashaya tribe was able to buy back some of their ancestral land. They were able to purchase 688 acres, which along Highway 1 corridor, I couldn't tell you specifically, but they do have a sign out now. And it straddles Highway 1. And of that 688, 52 acres of that is along the coast here. And I will talk more about why it's important for indigenous communities to still have access to fishing and harvesting various foods and seaweeds along the coast here. And since we're on the topic of food and seaweed and different biodiversity, again, Gualala Point Regional Park is in a very unique ecosystem. Estuaries form where fresh water meets ocean water. And this area has always been a draw to humans because humans, like animals, need healthy habitats which consist of shelter, food, water, and space. So this area is super biodiverse. And as you can see from this image, there's some salmon. There's historical evidence that Kashaya and Pomo ancestors or families hunted cormorants, mussels, this is rockfish, seaweed, also ate purple sea urchin. There's boysenberries up here. There's different types of berries, and of course quail and deer. So some of these are still, that I know, are still being harvested for food. And one of the things to understand about harvesting food is also a way of perpetuating the culture. And I'll talk a little more about why it's important to have healthy ecosystems, not only to perpetuate the biodiversity of an area, but to also help support the culture, to perpetuate the culture of different communities. So natural resources was a big demand and draw for people to come through this area. And I just wanted to quickly review the definition that I will be using for natural resources is material or substances such as minerals, forests, water, and fertile land that occur without human action and can be used for economic gain, and that also includes animals. And one of the cultures and communities that came along the coast that were really looking for natural resource, in particular animal fur, is the Russians came down. Some of you may know this from just your history class or from living in the area and knowing about Fort Russ, which I'll briefly touch on. But the Russian American company was a colony really that kind of started in Alaska, and they had colonies all over Alaska, and the Russians were into fur trading, in particular seal and sea otter, and they were running out of supplies and food. And as I mentioned, they were colonizing these areas, and they colonized this area, which is the Aleutian Islands, which is a series of islands, and where a lot of native Alaskans lived. In particular, we call them the Aleutian natives, and they were really known for being amazing hunters. You can see this. They call this a badarka, we call it a kayak, and it was made out of seal skin, bones, and driftwood. Remember, this is in the tundra, there's no trees, so they would get whatever wood would wash up on shore. And the next image, it shows you why they were such successful hunters. If you look at this, if you were an animal, you'd think it's a giant bird. And so they would wear different feathers and things to kind of camouflage themselves as this giant bird, and were able to get really close to those marine mammals that they were hunting. And the Russians learned a lot. They hired them on, but they weren't able to pay them. And so a lot of Aleutian natives came down California coast with the Russians. Also, At this time, the Russians wanted to trade with the United States. However, California was not part of the United States in 1799 and the early 1800s. It was still part of New Spain and eventually became part of Mexico. So the Russians thought they were going to be able to trade with the US, but the Spains were like, no. The Spanish, New Spain was like, no. Hence why we have the mission in Sonoma. The Spanish started sending military up here. General Vallejo lived here because they didn't want the Russians to colonize their already conquered land. So the Russians were down here primarily hunting sea otters and seals for fur. And as many of you may know already, they hunted a lot of the sea otters to extinction along our coastline. And there is also the colony, Fort Ross, which there's still remnants of, and they introduced a lot of their agriculture, apples, apricots, cherries. They brought those seeds with them in this area, and they were really looking for a place to start agriculture to be able to take food back to their colonies to Alaska. And so they lived in this area, what is now Fort Ross, for about 30 years. And there's still some historical evidence of that. But another community that came down with the Russians are the Sakha community, which is indigenous community of Siberia, which is part of Northern Soviet Union, which is now Russia. And this community came down along with the Aleutian, which is the Alaskan indigenous people, and the Russians during the fur trade. And you may be asking yourself, what does all of this have to do with Gualala Point Regional Park? Well, if you have been there, as some of you mentioned that you go there, have been there several times, you may have seen the Sergei ceremonial hitching posts, which were used for horses, but they also represent the tree of life. And so this is the part that I wanted to talk about when it comes to intrinsic value. It's valuing the intangible, the things that you can't hold, that you can't see. So if you can see looking out from this space, you could see the Pacific Ocean. And so this Sakha community believes that this has value because they know that their ancestors came through this area. So in 2014, Sonoma County Regional Parks collaborated with the Gualala Arts Center, a big spear leader in working with the parks and the community. The Sakha community was Ranger Sue Bechtel, and she really helped this project move along. They also set up some Sergei hitching posts over a ceremony hitching post in Fort Ross, and there was a ceremony there where they invited the Pomo and Kashaya to come out also. And if the ocean could talk, imagine all the different stories it would tell of people the shipwrecks, the pirates, or the different people who came along the coast and the different things that they did, all in search of, again, we want to be able to thrive, and so we need food and shelter and all of these things, natural resources. And so one particular natural resource that I didn't talk about, which John will talk about, but I just wanted to go back into the fact that demand for natural resources, and the Russians came down and they overhunted the sea otter. So if the ocean could talk, it would maybe tell us why, we now have an overflow of sea urchins, is because sea otters are a keystone species, which keeps this population down. The scientists can tell us this now. But, so they're overeating all the seaweed, which is causing the abalone to starve. And another keystone species that I don't have an image of, but also is the sea star, also eats the sea urchins. And a few years ago, it got there was the wasting disease of the sea stars. And so that also increased the population of sea urchins. So the natural resource that I didn't talk about, that I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, John, is timber and redwood trees, which this area is known to have an abundance of redwood trees. It's what's really iconic and beautiful of this area. So John, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, this will take me just a couple seconds. I'm going to share my screen, then I got to pull up here a full view. So yes, you can hear me, Irma? I'm all good?
I can hear you, and I can see your screen.
Excellent, perfect, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the surrounding area of Gualala Point Regional Park, and of course the river is the defining feature there. And so the river runs through redwood forests, and around the 1860s, these forests started to be logged. And of course, they were all old growth at the time. You can see this picture here. I don't think I've ever seen a redwood that big. You've got like 12 people sitting in the cut there, which is pretty amazing. So those were obviously very abundant. A couple other pictures here. One kind of interesting note, most of the redwood trees were harvested above the ground, sometimes up to 12 to 15 feet. You can see the gentlemen on the left here are standing on these planks, and that's where they would harvest the tree. And it was because the bottom trunk area wasn't quite as desirable wood-wise. Redwoods, of course, are extremely desirable because the old growths were very straight, straight grain. They also have, you know, they're water resistant, they're bug resistant all the way through, so they were a great building material. So, and you can still see some of these tall stumps along the river in certain places. And I know it's not our campground, but Gualala River Redwoods, the private campground across the road, has some stumps like this. My son's even played in some up at the top. So they're kind of an interesting, once you know what they are, it's kind of interesting link to the past. So right on the bend in the river, doesn't quite look like this anymore. There's been a mill there for a number of years. And so up here, you can see to the left is the mouth of the river. This would probably be right, this would be right where kind of Highway 101 is coming across. And so there was a mill there from the, I believe like around the 1860s all the way to the 1940s in various forms. And here's another kind of from the river side, almost a better picture there. You can kind of see the mill, and looks like those folks are coming down. Looks like they're actually a ferry across what looks like a horse team. And so to service the mill, they built a train running along the river and up north on the coast to a landing where they loaded the material. This is a picture. The train was kind of unique. They called it a Roman chariot gauge. It was almost 6 feet across, and that was because before they brought steam engines up there, they actually would take two horses side by side and pull carts along the rails with the wood. And so to give you an idea, this is about, I think, 5 feet 10 inches. The smart train tracks are about 4 feet 8 inches apart, just kind of give you an idea. And then also BART is 5 foot 6. So it was kind of a unique size, and you can kind of see, look at the cow catcher in the front's pretty wide there. So this, about 2.5 miles up the coast is where the timber went, and to a place called Bourne Landing. And you can see basically it was loaded from the cliffs, slid down these chutes, and the wood would stop right before the deck of the ship and be loaded on. This is a picture, a little close-up of a chute, kind of a different angle from Point Arena. So it wouldn't have been one at Bourne's Landing, but just gives you kind of an idea of how the wood was loaded. Currently, that bend in the river, the mill, I think, was dismantled for scrap, I read, in the 1940s for the World War II effort. But it's also, you know, right now it's used to access the river for kayakers and folks. And but it was still owned by the timber company. They were willing to sell it off. A private benefactor purchased it and is giving a local nonprofit, you know, a chance to basically come up with the money. And then some of it will go back in, well, some of it will be added to Gualala Point Regional Park, but the rest of it will remain in a sort of a private holding, but with access to the public. And they plan to put some trails in as well as improve river access. So when people come down to the river, kind of on that elbow right here, the bend right here, they won't do quite as much damage, kind of like they are doing now along the side. So they kind of make the access a little better. So the Gualala River watershed is pretty huge. About 75% of it's in Sonoma County. The other quarters in Mendocino. Sorry, my computer is just giving me fits here. But you can see the main fork of the river is the South Fork, and that actually follows the San Andreas Fault Line almost down to Cazadero. So it actually encompasses a good chunk of Sonoma County is actually in that watershed. So you can see it's a pretty significant river. There's always been recreation on the Gualala River. And this is a picture from, I think, like the 1915 or so of a family camping along here. And of course, it was at one time one of the premier coho and steelhead rivers in probably the world, not only Sonoma County and California. The picture on the right here of these two women is from 1915. I guess they put on a women's fishing derby day in Gualala, and so this is all the steelhead that was caught. To the left is actually Earl Warren, who was the governor of California at one time, and here he's got 2 steelhead he caught in the river. So, but unfortunately, the river was pretty plentiful until about the 1950s, and I guess so logging really picked up on the Gualala River in 1906 to fund or to basically supply the materials to rebuild San Francisco after the earthquake, and then it continued. But even in the 1930s and 40s, in the upper stretch of the Gualala River, there were still quite a few old growth left. And the old growth along the banks of the river really was what made it a wonderful steelhead salmon fishery. And it's because they would shade the river to keep it cool, these big, huge trees. They drop a lot of nutrients, insects, things like that for the fish. And so those were 2 real important things: food source, cooling the water. And then of course, they were removed and that benefit was taken away for the fish. And then what happened also is they were logged and increased sedimentation, which the salmon, so the steelhead and the coho salmon need clean gravel bars to lay their eggs. And when they fill up with sediment, they block off oxygen to the little fish eggs. And so it makes for the habitat's not quite as good. Another thing that's important and unique about the Gualala River is that the sandbar is allowed to kind of open and close on its own. And this creates what's a lagoon at the mouth of the river. And that lagoon is super important for the young salmon and steelhead, because it gives them a chance before they get out to the ocean, kind of a protected area, to kind of get bigger, fatten up, eat, so that they have a better chance of surviving their time in the ocean. And if you might have heard in recent years, the Russian River, they would always breach the sandbar at some point when it got high, so it wouldn't flood some of the the buildings and stuff and the houses way back along the river. They're the Russian. But because of acknowledging the lagoon is important to steelhead, they now scrape it, so they lower it, but they don't just cut right through it. They kind of scrape it so that the lagoon still forms somewhat and the houses don't flood, and it gives the benefit to the juvenile fish. So one thing I wanted to mention is that the Sea Ranch was actually essential in the formation of Gualala Point Regional Park. The property was donated by the Oceanic Properties, which is the company that developed the Sea Ranch. And probably most of you are familiar with the Sea Ranch, but it was certainly at the time was a very forward-thinking, progressive design. They talked about how one of the things was that they wanted to link the buildings and nature into an organized whole rather than just a group of pretty houses, meaning they wanted the buildings to fit in with the landscape. There's very few enclosed yards at the Sea Ranch, and all the common landscaping is natural, with sort of an emphasis on native plants. And that has been from the beginning. You can kind of see these were the Sea Ranch principles, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but it was maintain unique character of the North Coast, modesty of house size. I think there's a thing in there on the left, the yes principles, native plants. On the right, they didn't want, exotic plants, put in there. They wanted it to stay natural. They didn't want huge houses. They want houses that fit with the landscape. And so, really it was a progressive design, but the Sea Ranch itself kind of ran up against the environmentalists of Sonoma County, because it was a 10-mile section, and when they developed it, they weren't going to allow any public access. And so what that did was kind of spur citizens to kind of come forward and put Proposition B on the Sonoma County ballot, which said that if zoning was changed from agricultural to allow housing and development, you had to provide access to the coast. And that was defeated in 1968. But it gave rise, the group that put on the ballot Coast was Californians organized for acquiring access to state tidelands, because the state tidelands, meaning the high tide line at the coast, is open to the public. The public owns it. Doesn't mean they can always access it, but they own it. And so Proposition B helped create the coalition that went on to pass Proposition 20 in 1972, which was the Coastal Protection Act. And basically it gave rise to the Coastal Commission, so a state agency that basically was charged with governing the coast, for the benefit of the public, basically, and so with preserving access and views being some of the highest priorities. And so, of course, it was kind of perfect timing, because the Sea Ranch kind of started it, but basically in 1958 to 64, PG&E had been trying to put an atomic power plant at Bodega Head. people had sort of kind of started to rise up against sort of the industrialization of the coast. And then you had the big Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969. So all these led to public, because Proposition 20 had to be approved by the public, and all this led to, all these things sort of led to the public supporting this new regulation, new body to regulate the coastline. And it's funny because 2 of the 3 things happened in Sonoma County. The Sea Ranch kind of helped spur it, as well as the Bodega Power Plant. So so it's interesting. A lot of stuff happens in Sonoma County. So again, there's always been a park plan for the Gualala River in Sonoma County. As far back as 1955, it was identified, and you can see, it's gorgeous, the mouth of the river. It's a place that really is definitely worth protecting. So in 1969, the Sea Ranch basically, as public access, donated I think a total 103 acres to the county for a park. They were really hoping that that would suffice for access for the county. The county took it, started developing it. In 1971, it opened with some minimal amenities like a parking lot and some trails. In 1975, the Visitor Center opened, and the Visitor Center is still there. It's still got great exhibits. As Irma said, it's run by volunteers. It's an awesome place. If you live up there and have to be on this presentation, please consider volunteering. It's closed right now, of course, COVID-19, but it will reopen again. It was designed, Sea Ranch did put some, kind of stipulations on the property when they donated it. They wanted all the buildings to sort of blend in with their style of architecture, so it made for a unique, really pretty building. They also didn't want at first any exposed power lines. So a windmill was put in to basically generate electricity for the center. And it was in operation providing energy for the center for about 12 years. It even had a battery pack. It was pretty forward thinking, but it just ultimately couldn't supply enough power for the center because the center, it's cold up there, it needed heaters. And so in 1987, the center was actually connected to PG&E. So in 76 was the official park dedication, because that's when the campground opened. It's my favorite campground, the regional park system. If you have not been, it's gorgeous. Half the sites are on the Gualala River. These are some of the walk-in sites where you park and you kind of unload and you walk in about, I think the most it's about 300 feet. But so it's just a fantastic, gorgeous place to camp. In 1985, after much back and forth, the Sea Ranch access trails were dedicated. And so basically you have Gualala Point Regional Park, but you have 6 access trails through the Sea Ranch that they provide a parking lot, bathrooms, and access typically to a really nice beach. That's how most of them are set up. And so again, this is because of the Coastal Commission. Coastal Act passed in 1970, or Proposition 20 passed in 1972. Since then, there really hasn't been a lot that's happened to the park. It's very similar to the way it was. Of course, the parkland was actively managed by the Kashaya, the local Native American tribe, utilizing fire to keep the prairies open for hunting. Then it was grazed after that. Once it became a park, the grazing stopped, and so of course the controlled the burns, and so you can see the vegetation's kind of sprung back, so it's changed in character a bit. The other major thing that almost happened was back in 2015. The timberland bordering the river on both Sonoma and Mendocino County sides was up for sale, and the county, regional parks, ag and open space, Sonoma Land Trust, a number of other nonprofits put in a bid for it, which they didn't actually win. But if it had gone into public ownership, the plan was to expand pretty significantly Gualala Point Regional Park, basically on both sides of the river. And the plan wasn't to stop logging, but to sustainably log it. And so the property would have probably been pieced together with different agencies managing it. But one of the things that was planned to happen if the bid had been won by the county and the other entities was that it was going to, basically become a huge expansion of the Gualala Point Regional Park. So otherwise, the park's just a fantastic place to visit. And has an amazing history of the area, and I encourage you to do so if you haven't been up there. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Irma, and I'm going to stop my share here. All right. And
All right, thanks, John.
do you
So,
have access again? Yeah, good. Cool, and thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
awesome. Okay, John, I just want to confirm that you all can see my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry for the delay, folks. Okay, great. Thank you, John. So I just want to quickly recap a little bit of what John was mentioning about the timber companies, the logging that happened up there. And also this image, I know it's a little blurry and hard to see, but another tree that was being harvested along the coast was tan oak. The Spanish made tallow and hide industry in Northern California boom. And so these are tan oaks that are being sent to San Francisco to leather tanneries. And so that is another tree that was being harvested up here. And so something else that shaped the landscape and that continues to shape the landscape up in the coast is agriculture. There's still a lot of cattle. There's vineyards in Annapolis, and all of those take resources from local watersheds, of course, to sustain these areas, to sustain the agriculture and the cattle. But also, we have the various overlap of different cultures coming along the coast and coexisting with the current indigenous communities that live there, the Kashaya and the Pomo. We have Russian communities that come all the way from Russia to visit Fort Ross. So there's a lot of ties to this area among the Russian community. And also just an overlay of different communities coming together along the coast that really helps the biodiversity, human flora and fauna thrive. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us for this short presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in our chat box. And also for further information about other webinars, please visit sonomacountyparks.org. And we just want to put in a shout out for our Sonoma County Parks Foundation. They support a lot of our programming, and feel free to check out their website for any way that you can support or feedback. And with that, I am going to say goodbye and thank you again for joining us. And hopefully we're going to have another webinar. Hopefully you can join us next Tuesday for looking at the Laguna de Santa Rosa past and present. And with that, I am going to say goodbye. I'll check the chat really quick to see if anybody has any questions. Let me see here. Oh, okay. Awesome. Yeah, I see some people saying they can't wait to visit. I hope so too. Please do check our website to make sure there's a list on the website that lets you know which parks are open. And please do follow health protocols, social distancing, single file line when passing. So yeah, and we also have a video on our website that gives you information about how to safely enjoy your parks. And thank you all for supporting Sonoma County Regional Parks.